There are certain Craigslist categories you should never click on: miscellaneous, gigs, and, of course, anything involving meat that doesn't come from a grocery store. But in the darker corners of the early 2000s internet, some people weren't just selling used sofas or asking for help moving. Some people were looking for dinner, and some people were looking to be dinner. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. Post your location and local time down below, because I guarantee this story hits different at Tua Isa Tuum. And now, let's meet the man who wanted to be eaten. Legally, as far as German suburbs go, Rothenburg was about as uneventful as it gets. Cobblestone streets, cautious smiles from neighbors, the occasional sound of a dachshund yapping at the mailman. It was the kind of place where even the squirrels probably obeyed traffic laws. Armin Meiwes was born here in 1961. He was a quiet, lonely child, the kind who arranged his stuffed animals in a neat semicircle and gave them structured agendas. His father walked out when he was 8. His older brothers left not long after. He was left alone with his mother. Waltrude, a strict, domineering woman who reportedly made Norman Bates look like a chill roommate, with no siblings, no father, and one rather intense mother. Armin's imagination filled in the rest. He invented an imaginary brother named Frankie, who told him stories and helped him play. Frankie wasn't the kind of imaginary friend who told you to skip rope. Frankie told Armin that maybe, if he ate someone, that person could live on inside him forever. You know, normal imaginary brother things. As Armin grew older, so did his appetite for stories. He was especially drawn to Hansel and Gretel, with its delightfully twisted themes of children, food, and ovens. In The Cannibal Witch, Armin saw something fascinating, not horrifying, just compelling. After all, didn't everyone wonder what human flesh tasted like? It would be decades before he acted on those thoughts. In the meantime, Armin lived an extremely ordinary life. He became a computer technician, had co-workers who thought he was nice, quiet, polite. He drank beer at parties and once dressed up as a Smurf for Halloween. True fact, the German word for Smurf is Schlumpf, which somehow makes this creepier. He even joined the German army for a time and learned basic survival skills, you know, for emergencies or long meat-curing projects. Now, let's pause to sprinkle in a genuine historical fact. Germany has no laws specifically forbidding cannibalism. You can't murder someone, of course. You can't desecrate a corpse. But if someone consents to being eaten voluntarily and with documentation, that wasn't legally accounted for at the time. Philosophers have debated for years whether the law should protect us from ourselves or just from each other. That gray area would become very, very important. By the early 2000s, Armin's fantasies weren't just private anymore. He had internet access, and if the internet is good at anything, it's connecting people who should never meet. Enter the Cannibal Cafe. This now defunct website was an anonymous haven for people with fantasies that, well, ate away at you. Role players, fetishists, even legitimate sadists gathered to post ads, share fiction, and for a select few, find real-world connections. Some ads were clearly roleplay, looking to be devoured by a sexy dragon girl. Others blurred the line, desire to be slowly butchered and consumed. No safe word. And then there was Armin's ad. Simple, to the point, not exactly subtle. Looking for a well-built 18 to 30-year-old to be slaughtered and then consumed. That's not a euphemism. He expected a few fantasy responses, maybe some weird photos. Instead, he got dozens of replies from people who seemed genuinely interested. Some backed out once they realized he wasn't kidding. One guy flew in, chickened out at the airport, and flew home with a very awkward story to tell his luggage. But Armin was patient, polite. He didn't push anyone. And then, on March 5, 2001, he got an email from a man named Bernd Jürgen Brandes, a 43-year-old engineer from Berlin, Bernd had a corporate job, an ex-girlfriend, and a quiet, compartmentalized life. He was intelligent, well-spoken, and deeply repressed. After his mother's death, something seemed to break in him or perhaps unlock. He'd been exploring extreme fetishes online, self-harm, submission, castration fantasies. He wasn't looking for pain. He was looking for obliteration. And Armin was offering a way out that no therapist ever could. Their messages grew intense, then obsessive, then logistical. Bernd didn't just want to be eaten. He wanted to participate in the experience. He wanted it filmed. He wanted to feel it. And most of all, he wanted to consent in full. He drew up a contract, detailing what was allowed, when he could revoke permission, and most importantly, that Armin was not responsible for anything that happened. In the world of legal history, this would eventually be known as the Rotenberg Agreement, a casual, signed permission slip for being consumed. There's a philosophical debate that keeps coming up here. Can consent make anything moral? If someone begs to be killed, and they're of sound mind, is it still murder? Germany, at the time, didn't know how to answer that. Honestly, it still doesn't. Anyway, back to our gentleman. Bernd booked a train ticket. He told co-workers he was taking a long weekend. He brought his toothbrush and his favorite suit, because some dinner guests really do like to dress up. He arrived at Armin's country home with a bottle of cold medicine, a calm demeanor, and a chilling certainty about what he wanted. This wasn't a crime scene yet. Not officially. It was just two men, in a house, with a very peculiar date night planned. And this might be a good time to mention in 2001, one of the best-selling products in Germany was Wurstwasser, a bottled drink that tastes like hot dog water. Which, in hindsight, feels cosmically ironic. By now, it's late evening. Bernd sits on Armin's couch. The camera is already rolling, and somewhere in the background, a pot is starting to boil. Next up, cooking. Kind of. If you ever find yourself sitting on a stranger's couch, sipping tea, while discussing the preferred method of your own consumption, you've taken a very specific left turn in life. Bernd Jürgen Brandes had taken that turn with his eyes wide open. The train ride from Berlin to Rotenburg had been quiet, scenic. Trees rolled past like polite, green witnesses. Bernd sat calmly, dressed sharply, carrying a small overnight bag, inside a change of clothes, some sleeping pills, painkillers, a shaving kit, and his ID, just in case someone needed to identify what was left. You know, after Armin Meiwes met him at the station and drove him home through country roads. Nothing seemed out of place. The sun was setting. Birds were chirping. Armin made light conversation. In fact, Bernd later commented on tape that Armin was very considerate. When they got to the house, Bernd took a tour. It was charming, in a rural German kind of way, except for the one room with padded walls, a custom-made butcher's bench, and a video camera mounted discreetly in the corner. That room was different. Armin called it his slaughter room. Not metaphorically. He had built it for this moment. True fact, Armin's house was a 44-room mansion inherited from his mother, who had recently passed away. He lived there alone. The house was cold, quiet, and filled with antique furniture and unsettling vibes. The kind of place where every creak sounds like a warning, and even the furniture seems like it could keep secrets. But tonight wasn't about ambiance. It was about logistics. They sat down for dinner, just a normal meal. A bit of chicken, some vegetables, red wine. You know, a pre-cannibalism palate cleanser. They talked. They laughed a little. Armin suggested watching a movie, and they settled on an episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation. You can't make that up. Jean-Luc Picard's voice filled the room while one man planned to eat the other. Then they got down to business. Bernd took a few sleeping pills and some schnapps to dull the pain. Armin began filming. The tone was eerily calm, like a tutorial. A very disturbing tutorial. Armin asked if Bernd still consented. He did. In fact, Bernd had requested to have his penis amputated first and cooked so they could both try it together. That was the plan, share a symbolic meal from the body of the volunteer. A grotesque communion. And here we reach a real biological tidbit. The human body does not handle high levels of blood loss from genital wounds particularly well. Shocking. I know. There are arteries in that region that act like enthusiastic fire hoses. The moment Armin sliced through, Bernd began to bleed profusely, but he remained conscious. In fact, he reportedly tried to eat part of the cooked flesh himself. Armin had fried it with garlic, pepper, and wine reduction. Sadly, it was too tough to chew. An anticlimactic Yelp review, to be honest. When the frying pan failed, Armin tried boiling it. That didn't help either. The meat shriveled and became rubbery. This led to one of the most tragicomic phrases ever uttered on camera in a true crime setting. It was too chewy. This moment is where the story starts to blur the line between absurdity and horror. The scene is simultaneously ridiculous and unthinkable, a culinary failure with irreversible consequences. Bernd, meanwhile, was now lying in the bathtub, bleeding out slowly. He asked Armin to read him a book. So Armin read a Star Trek novel while Bernd drifted in and out of consciousness. The bathroom lights flickered. The night grew darker. There's a small, grimly beautiful phrase in one of the case transcripts. He wanted to feel the light go out. Here we must pause for a moment to acknowledge a disturbing debate in the medical ethics community. It revolves around autonomy, the right to die on one's own terms. Some argue that, in rare cases, assisted suicide should extend beyond illness and into philosophical territory if life is unbearable to a person. And they are of sound mind. Who are we to intervene? Bernd's case became a poster child for the most extreme end of this question. Because he was calm, sane, coherent, and he wanted this. But wanting something and surviving it are very different things. As Bernd's condition worsened, Armin hesitated. He gave him more sleeping pills. He tried to stall. He ran back and forth between the bathroom and the kitchen, filming parts of it. At one point, he sat and talked to the camera about how peaceful Bernd seemed, like a host giving commentary between courses. And this is where the freezer comes in. True quirky fact, Armin had named his deep freezer Monica. He liked labeling things. The freezer was industrial-sized, big enough to store a human body in pieces, which was the plan. Eventually, Bernd lost consciousness. Armin stood in the doorway, holding a knife. Hours passed. He paced. He told himself he'd wait until the man was truly gone. But as the night turned into early morning, he made the decision. He kissed Bernd on the lips and said, "Thank you." Then he slit his throat. The moment was filmed, though the footage has never been released publicly and honestly. Let's keep it that way. Now the house was still. Blood on the tiles. Silence, except for the hum of the fridge. Armin began his butcher work. He was methodical. He'd studied anatomy, watched slaughterhouse videos, read up on proper carving technique. He strung the body up by the feet and began removing usable sections muscle tissue from the thighs, arms, buttocks. He removed the head and buried it in the garden. The rest he labeled vacuum sealed and stored in Monica. The first dish he made was a simple steak, lightly sautéed. He ate it with potatoes and Brussels sprouts, red wine, candlelight. He later described the taste as pork, but more delicate. That alone sparked academic debate among chefs, anthropologists, and weird Reddit users. What does human flesh actually taste like? Spoiler, we're probably not supposed to know. In total, Armin saved over 20 kilograms of meat and consumed it slowly over the next 10 months. He rationed carefully, special occasions only, birthdays, holidays, Tuesdays that just felt festive. He filmed himself cooking. He sometimes spoke to the camera like a home chef. He smiled. He chewed thoughtfully. He said he felt close to Bernd. No fast food, no waste. The neighbors, of course, noticed nothing. He was polite, kept his lawn tidy, waved at kids, probably borrowed sugar without a trace of guilt. But something else began to stir in him. He started posting new ads, and this time, someone said, "Nope," and called the cops. In the history of cannibal-related arrests, and yes, that is apparently a category this one began, as many do, with a concerned internet user saying, this guy seems serious. It had been nearly a year since Armin Meiwes had killed and consumed Bernd Brandis. By all appearances, Armin was leading a relatively normal life. He kept to himself, still worked freelance IT gigs, mowed the lawn, walked to town for groceries, though one suspects he skipped the meat aisle with a smirk. But after many months, he started feeling peckish. Not just in the culinary sense. He missed the ritual, the drama, the slow courtship of finding the right dinner guest. So, like a disturbed romantic rejoining a dating app, Armin went back to the Cannibal Cafe, and again, he posted ads inviting anyone willing to be slaughtered to reach out. This time, his tone was more confident, like a guy who's figured out how to get a sauce just right and now wants to show off for company. But his posts were flagged. Not because they were more grotesque, if anything. They were weirdly polite, but because someone on the forum realized he isn't role-playing. That user, thankfully equipped with a functioning moral compass, contacted the authorities. Now, the German police had received weird internet tips before, but this one was specific, credible, and included a username that matched several other dark forum posts. After doing a little cyber detective work, they identified the IP address, then the town, then the exact house, and then the freezer. On December 10, 2002, they arrived at Armin's home in Rothenburg with a search warrant. Armin answered the door calmly, as if he were expecting a package, not a full tactical team. He was polite, courteous, and even offered them coffee classic German hospitality. Really. But when officers began searching the house, things went from curious to horrifying within minutes. The padded room, the blood-stained butcher's bench, the camera setup, the collection of knives, hooks, pulleys, the videotapes labeled in neat handwriting. And, of course, Monica the freezer. Inside, vacuum-sealed packages, each carefully labeled with dates and contents. Thigh, rump, flank, human meat, frozen and catalogued like leftovers from a particularly macabre Sunday roast. Now, fun real-world fact. The temperature of a standard deep freezer is 18 degrees, 0 degrees, cold enough to preserve meat for up to a year. Armin had been keeping Bernd's remains with restaurant-level precision. The police opened one of the packages. It smelled faintly metallic. Not rotten, just sterile. Like the air inside a morgue or a very unfortunate butcher shop. The lead detective turned to Armin and asked, "What is this?" Armin, with the emotional tone of someone explaining a complicated soufflé recipe, said, "That's my friend. He wanted this." Naturally, they arrested him on the spot. Back at the station, Armin confessed everything. Voluntarily. No hesitation. In fact, he seemed relieved. He told the story like someone recounting a breakup with moments of nostalgia, flickers of remorse, and weirdly poetic language. He described how they met, the contract, the shared meal, the slow death, the freezer diaries. He even offered them the videotape, saying, "That will explain it better than I can." They didn't believe him at first. Who would? So they watched the tape, and then they really believed him. Now, there's a bit of forensic trivia here. The video was nearly 4 hours long. Police officers had to watch it in segments, taking breaks to compose themselves. Several needed counseling afterward. One officer later described it as the most disturbing thing I've ever seen. And I once responded to a clown fire. Okay, that last part may be apocryphal. But you get the idea. Meanwhile, news of the arrest started leaking to the press, and when reporters found out that a man in rural Germany had not only killed and eaten someone with their consent, but also filmed it, the headlines exploded. The public was fascinated, horrified, morbidly curious. Armin Meiwes became known as the Rotenburg cannibal. Suddenly, the sleepy little town was swarmed with journalists, satellite trucks, and podcast producers rubbing their hands together. The neighbors, who had thought Armin was a bit odd, but harmless, were now giving interviews that included phrases like, "He always waved hello. I never suspected he had ham made of hands in his fridge." Around this time, internet sleuths began unearthing screenshots from the Cannibal Cafe. The forum itself was shut down shortly after, but not before its archives were picked over by curious creepers and digital anthropologists. One of the more disturbing revelations: Armin wasn't alone. There were dozens, hundreds of users role-playing similar fantasies. Some were harmless, many were not. But Armin had crossed the line from fantasy into filet mignon. Legal authorities were now left with a problem. Germany, as we mentioned before, had no law explicitly outlawing cannibalism. So, what exactly had Armin done? Well, clearly he had killed a man. But the man asked for it, signed papers, filmed the whole thing. He even thanked Armin. So now the courts had to wrestle with a deliciously awful question. If two adults consent to an act that results in death, and the act involves seasoning, is it still murder? At the same time, people from every corner of society chimed in. Ethicists debated it on late-night panels. Lawyers argued over definitions of consent. Talk shows hosted cannibal-themed weeknights. Even philosophers who usually stuck to safer topics like trolley problems were like, "Okay, let's throw this into the trolley tracks." Even within the courtroom, opinions were split. Prosecutors argued that Bernd was not mentally competent at the time of his consent. Therefore, the entire premise was invalid. Defense lawyers claimed Armin committed assisted suicide, not murder. Meanwhile, Armin sat calmly in his holding cell, reading science fiction novels, eating only vegetarian meals, and occasionally giving interviews where he said things like, "I didn't want to kill him. I just wanted to feel close to someone," which is, if nothing else, the most German-sounding cannibal quote in history. Back at the house, forensic teams were still cataloging evidence. They found blood traces all over the bathroom, DNA on the cooking utensils, multiple tapes with Armin narrating his culinary adventures. They even tested the meat to confirm that it came from a single human donor, because when you're investigating cannibalism, you want to make sure the sourcing is ethical. Right. At this point, the public couldn't look away. The Rotenburg cannibal became a household name. His face was on tabloids. His quotes were trending on early internet forums. True crime shows lined up to license the story. And in one surreal twist, a UK metal band called Carcass used the phrase "grind your mind" with Bernd in a promotional sticker. Because humanity is classy like that. Armin Meiwes was now infamous, but his trial hadn't even started yet. And the next question would make legal history. Could a man who ate another man with that man's permission be charged with murder? The courtroom in Kassel, Germany, was packed tighter than a bratwurst casing. Lawyers in sharp suits, journalists whispering into microphones, philosophy professors blinking in existential disbelief. Everyone had shown up for the show. Not every day does a court try to define where consent ends and a meat cleaver begins. Armin Meiwes, for his part, looked calm, polite. He wore a blue sweater and glasses, with the demeanor of someone who'd wandered in looking for the local chess club, but decided to stay and confess to fine dining. It was December 2003, almost 2 years after Bernd had been willingly killed, butchered, and turned into schnitzel. Now the German legal system had the unenviable job of deciding what that was. Not legally, existentially. The prosecution argued murder. Pure and simple. Brandes was dead. Armin had killed him. There was video footage, body parts. cookbooks with annotations. But the defense came out swinging with a truly brain-melting argument. This was not murder. It was assisted suicide. And not just any assisted suicide. This was done under explicit, documented, enthusiastically repeated informed consent. Brandes had signed a contract, asked for specific details, repeatedly emphasized that this was his wish, on camera. While alert, let's take a philosophical pause. This exact scenario became a case study in bioethics seminars worldwide. It made its way into legal textbooks, classroom hypotheticals, and unfortunate freshman dorm debates. If someone wants to die, and they want you to kill them, is it ethical? If they want you to eat them afterward, does that cancel out the consent? Is there a moral difference between stabbing someone in anger and carving them up with a romantic sauté in mind? Back to court. The judges watched the videotape. All 4 hours of it. Multiple times. The footage was never released to the public, and that's probably a kindness, but it's been described as chilling, clinical, and unforgettably surreal. One journalist who peeked at the written summaries said it read like a cooking show with an existential crisis. As the tape played, everyone in the courtroom sat frozen. The prosecution glanced nervously at the jury. The defense tried not to look smug. Armin just nodded along like he was critiquing his own lighting. To make things even weirder, a series of experts were called to testify. Psychiatrists evaluated Armin and concluded he was legally sane, not psychotic. Just driven by a very niche desire. One expert described him as deeply lonely, fixated on human closeness through extreme means. Another likened him to a tragic philosopher cannibal, which honestly sounds like a Morrissey album. Meanwhile, Brandes' background came under scrutiny. He'd had a stable job in Berlin as an engineer, lived alone, was known to be quiet, disciplined, but deeply private. His internet history, however, painted a very different picture. He had been obsessively researching castration, bodily sacrifice, and cannibalism forums for months. He had even attempted self-surgery before meeting Armin. Yes, that's exactly as horrifying as it sounds. So now, the court faced a rare creature, a case where both parties wanted the outcome. It wasn't vengeance. It wasn't coercion. It was a slow, consensual, documented culinary arrangement that ended in death. A key turning point came when prosecutors asked Armin if he would do it again. Armin paused, blinked, then said, "Only if the person wanted it, and I could be sure," which, as you can imagine, did not help his defense. Let's introduce a historical legal fact here. At the time of the crime, Germany's penal code did not explicitly criminalize consensual homicide. There was a law for killing on request, which carried a lesser sentence, usually reserved for assisted euthanasia. So at first, in 2004, Armin Meiwes was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 812 years in prison. Public response nuclear. The courtroom buzzed. German newspapers screamed headlines. Ethicists panicked. School teachers rewrote their lesson plans with asterisks. The idea that someone could film themselves killing and eating a person and only get 8 years. That didn't sit well. Germany's Supreme Court agreed. The verdict was overturned. The case was retried in 2006 this time, with more philosophical firepower, more legal ammunition, and the general consensus that, okay, yeah, we have to call this murder. At the second trial, Armin was reconvicted this time of murder and disturbing the peace of the dead, which, yes, is a real German criminal charge. Very polite phrasing for stop seasoning corpses. He was sentenced to life in prison. Back in court, when asked for a final statement, Armin didn't cry. He didn't apologize in the traditional way. He said, "I regret what I did. I will never do it again. I found other ways to feel close to people." He later became a vegetarian in prison. That detail caught fire online. "Cannibal goes vegan" became the punchline of late-night monologues. meme threads, and dorm room debates. Was it guilt irony, a moral pivot, or maybe just a guy trying to be considerate of the cafeteria staff? Either way, Armin's story had already passed into legend, and the academic community was having a field day. The case became part of university syllabi on ethics, law, psychology, and the limits of bodily autonomy. Documentaries started rolling out. Tabloids rebranded him the real-life Hannibal. Horror filmmakers used his story as loose inspiration. 2006's Butterfly, A Grim Love Story was banned in parts of Germany because Armin sued for defamation. He won. Meanwhile, the Cannibal Cafe vanished. Shut down. Its dark little corner of the web flickered and went offline, though copies of it lived on in the internet's dusty archives. Think of it as the cyber version of an abandoned house where the walls still whisper. But Armin's name that stayed. He wasn't the first cannibal in history. Far from it. Humans have eaten each other for millennia for survival, for ritual, for war. But he was the first to do it with legal paperwork, camera angles, and a deep freeze labeled by body part. This case forced a modern society to ask ancient questions about death, about desire, about the stomach-churning territory where consent and violence overlap. But most of all, it made us ask the one question we never wanted to answer: how far can free will really go? And maybe, more disturbingly, should it? In the fridge, the meat was starting to run low, not metaphorically, literally. Armin Meiwes had been methodical in his dining habits. Each meal was an event-clean table, quiet music, no distractions. He never rushed, always used proper silverware, ate slowly, chewed thoroughly, and above all, treated each bite as a kind of spiritual ritual. He wasn't just consuming calories. He believed he was honoring burned brandas, absorbing him, preserving him, keeping him alive in some strange protein-based afterlife. For 10 months after the killing, Armin had eaten nearly all of the 20 kilograms of human flesh he'd carefully butchered and vacuum-sealed. Thigh steaks, shoulder roasts, a surprisingly lean forearm fillet. True biological fact: human meat has a high iron content, similar to pork or veal, depending on muscle composition. He kept a log, not just of meals, but of thoughts, feelings, like a chef's diary written by someone whose cookbook might accidentally summon demons. Sometimes, he'd write poetic reflections. Today I ate the last of the calf. I remembered his voice when he said goodbye. Sometimes, he drew little sketches. A sausage here, a heart there, no captions, and yes, there was one particularly awkward journal entry where he wrote, "I think next time I'll try grilling. The pan dries it out too much." Because in between the horror, there were these tragically banal moments: cooking notes, seasoning preferences, complaints about tough cuts, like watching a monster clip coupons. What Armin hadn't expected was how lonely the aftermath would feel. He didn't miss the violence. That part had scared him, shaken him. He'd hesitated before killing Bernd. He'd hoped, deep down, that the whole thing might dissolve before the knife had to come out. But once it was done, and the freezer was full, there was something hollow. Bernd was supposed to live on inside him, but all Armin had now were fading taste memories, a few greasy Tupperware stains, and the gnawing silence of a big house filled with echoes. So, as you do when you're lonely and consumed your last friend like a really messed up pot roast, Armin went online. Back to the Cannibal Cafe. This was a different internet than today's slick, polished web. In the early 2000s, forums were ugly, slow-loading, and strangely personal. They felt like digital basements smelling of carpet mold and ambition. And in the Cannibal Cafe, Armin was something of a legend. He didn't boast. He wasn't crude. In fact, his posts were almost shockingly polite. He didn't say, "I'm the guy who ate someone." He said things like, "seeking another volunteer." Must be serious, kind, clean, and clear about intentions. You know, like a roommate ad from hell. Many of the replies he got were again fantasy, role play, people who didn't fully grasp that he had already done this once. But Armin could tell who was serious and who wasn't. He read their words carefully. He asked thoughtful follow-up questions. Sometimes he'd exchange dozens of emails with someone before deciding they weren't the right flavor of damaged. A recurring name showed up: Big Daddy Carl. He claimed he wanted to be part of something historic. Armin asked, "Are you truly ready?" Carl replied, "If you promise, it'll be slow." But when Armin suggested a date, Carl ghosted like a nervous Tinder match. Then came Let's Gone, then Meet for You 88, then Soul Snack, all talk, no cutlery. And here's a bizarre little detour at one point. Armin began posting on meat preparation subforums, not cannibalism-specific ones, just general cooking advice. He asked about tenderizing techniques, dry aging, marinades. It's unclear whether the other users ever realized the context. But somewhere out there may be a grilling enthusiast who unknowingly gave a cannibal their best spice rub recipe. That paprika tip really made the ribs sing. Thanks, Greg from Stuttgart. Meanwhile, offline, Armin was slipping. Friends noticed him becoming more withdrawn. Neighbors said he rarely left the house. He stopped showing up to local tech gigs. His only regular outings were to the market vegetables, mostly. The butcher shop was avoided entirely, either out of irony, guilt, or just a sense of professional competition. One neighbor recalled seeing him on the street with a reusable canvas grocery bag and a distant, absent look. She said he was humming something under his breath. A lullaby, maybe, or the Star Trek theme. It was around this time that he began writing letters to himself. Actual handwritten letters. He'd address them as if to a friend. Dear Bernd, dinner was quiet tonight. The wind knocked over the candle. Made me think of that last night. You asked me to light one more. I did. Some letters were about cooking. Some were about his dreams. One detailed a recurring nightmare where Bernd came back, not angry, not vengeful, just disappointed in the flavor. You overcooked me, Armin. No one likes jerky thighs. That line haunted him. Philosophers often talk about the paradox of desire. The more you indulge it, the more hollow it becomes. Armin had wanted to be close to someone. He had found the ultimate form of closeness. And yet, here he was, alone, eating bean stew and writing letters to meet ghosts. It wasn't that he felt guilty in the traditional way. He maintained that Bernd had wanted it, had insisted, had begged, but the intimacy of it had burned a hole in him. Something irreversible, not pain, exactly, but a kind of echo. And that's when he posted the ad again. He didn't really expect to find anyone, but he posted it anyway. It read, "Polite gentleman seeks willing volunteer. Preferably healthy, between 25 and 40. Must enjoy conversation, literature, and understand the seriousness of the request. Non-smoker preferred. I am experienced." This time, someone replied, but instead of bringing wine and body parts, they brought a printout of the post and a police badge. We're not saying justice always arrives on time, but sometimes it reads the message boards first. The moment Armin opened his inbox and saw the latest message, he thought he might have found the one. It was articulate, respectful, clear about expectations. The sender had read his previous posts, had questions about preparation, about pain, about whether candles would be involved. The tone was serious, like someone RSVPing to a very weird, very final dinner party. Armin replied promptly. He always did. There was a tone he tried to strike gentle, warm, thoughtful, like a therapist with a cleaver. He laid out his expectations. He asked for medical history. Then came the big one. I'll need a video recording of you confirming your consent. And the reply came back with something new. An attachment, labeled "You've been caught." That was when the smiling guy from Meat Market 32 revealed himself to be a cop. Armin stared at the screen, frozen, like his freezer had just turned on him. It wasn't that he was surprised to be caught. It was how the email was short and brutal. It referenced the previous posts, the IP trace, the name Brandes, and the court order en route to his address. He closed the laptop, looked around his quiet kitchen. The floor tiles gleamed under the fluorescent light. His stomach made a soft gurgling noise. He wasn't sure if it was hunger or fear. 3 days later, the police knocked on his door. You already know what happened next. But let's rewind a little back to the moment where he first decided to start filming everything. This wasn't just about cooking. Armin had, somewhere along the line, decided that if he was going to do this, he would document it, preserve it, for clarity, for honesty, maybe for history. He bought a second-hand camcorder in Kassel, charged the battery, practiced the angles. He even tested lighting setups using plush dolls before Bernd arrived. That's right. He did blocking. He filmed himself making tea, talking about philosophy, setting up the butcher's bench. When Bernd arrived, the camera was already rolling. What followed was over 4 hours of footage, which legal experts later dubbed the video. Let's be clear. The video is not public. It never will be. It has been locked away in German police archives, accessible only to select legal and psychiatric experts. But descriptions have leaked summaries, court transcripts, emotional reactions from those who watched it in trial. Here's what we know. The footage opens with both men talking calmly. They go over the contract. Bernd reads it aloud, signs it, smiles. Armin asks, "Are you sure?" Bernd says, "Yes. Please, there is tea. There is a failed cooking attempt involving garlic, wine, and genital tissue. There is, according to one investigator, a surreal moment where they laugh about the consistency. There is blood. Lots of it. But no screaming." Bernd never begs to stop. At one point, Bernd, naked, pale, trembling, asks to be read a book. Armin reads from Star Trek Voyager. Pathways. Hours pass. Then, in silence, Armin ends it. The rest of the footage shows cleanup, carving, labeling, dinner prep. It's a domestic horror film wrapped in a cooking show shot by a grieving monk. One court psychiatrist said, "It's less violent than you expect," which makes it worse. Now here's your required scientific detour. Human meat, when cooked, undergoes the Maillard reaction, just like other meats producing that savory browned aroma we associate with grilling. This is why human flesh, according to accounts from various survival situations, Donner Party, Andean plane crash, etc., often gets compared to pork. The term long pig used in some Pacific Islander cannibalism stories. Not a metaphor. So, scientifically speaking, Armin's food review checks out. But emotionally, spiritually, he was unraveling. Even before the arrest, Armin had started talking to the meat, not in a horror movie way. In a lonely, gentle, break-your-heart-a-little kind of way. He'd place a plate in front of him, take a bite, and whisper things like, "Hope I did you justice," or "This was your favorite chair," or "Once, just once, you'd be proud of this sauce." In the quiet of that house, the line between ritual and madness blurred. Was he honoring a friend, or stretching grief into something he could chew? Which brings us to the philosophers. After the trial, Armin became a case study for academic departments everywhere. In classrooms from Berlin to Berkeley, his actions were dissected like one of his roasts. One school of thought labeled it a failure of society. A man so lonely, so starved for intimacy, that he tried to literally absorb someone. Others saw it as the furthest extreme of autonomy, two men making the ultimate consensual decision, no matter how horrifying. Then there were the legal theorists. The German justice system had to invent precedent to handle this. There was no line in the law book for filmed consensual cannibalism. The closest thing they had was disturbing the peace of the dead, which, let's be honest, feels like something from an 18th century vampire ordinance. They had to reframe the entire concept of consent. You can consent to a tattoo, a surgery, even to death in some countries, under strict euthanasia laws. But can you consent to being eaten? No court had ever asked that. Not seriously. Not until Armin, and the ripples went beyond law. Online, the story became legend. Creepypasta, urban myth. This one was real. The forums filled with posts. Did you hear about the guy who ate a volunteer? Is that legal in Germany now? What cut do you think is best? Okay. Those users were banned. Podcasts scrambled to produce episodes. YouTube creators cranked out edgy thumbnails. Reddit threads speculated wildly about the video. People posted screenshots of fake recipes titled Branda's brisket. Humans can be very clever. And very awful. But underneath the memes and headlines was the real, undeniable strangeness of it all. One man wanted to be eaten. One man wanted to eat him. And for a brief, horrifying night, they were both happy. That fact, the calm, mutual nature of it, haunted everyone involved. This wasn't a crime of hate, or money, or impulse. It was dinner, with feeling. There's something uniquely terrifying about a quiet death. No screams, no struggle. Just two men in a kitchen, a camera humming softly, and the slow, patient process of one man becoming part of another. That was the mood Armin Meiwes returned to every night, even after the killing was done, after the trial, after the cameras, after the freezer was emptied. It lived in him, like Bernd's DNA curling into the corners of his organs. Every time he blinked, he could still see the outline of Bernd in the tub, not in panic, not in agony, just waiting. It turns out that guilt doesn't always come in waves. Sometimes it's a marinade. Let's zoom back to the house. After the police raid, Armin's mansion was turned into a forensic funhouse. Investigators cataloged every inch of the property. In the kitchen, knives, cutting boards, two well-used cast iron pans. In the basement, the infamous slaughter room, padded walls, hooks, restraints, and a surprisingly neat selection of labeled tools. The smell was antiseptic, tinged faintly with iron and cold fat. One officer later described the scene as a serial killer's IKEA showroom. In the living room, they found stacks of science fiction novels, a box of VHS tapes, and a small pile of handwritten letters, all addressed to Bernd. Every drawer, shelf, and surface seemed frozen in time, as if Armin had hit pause on a life that had already ended. But the strangest discovery came from the garage, tucked beneath some tarps and a spare tire. Investigators found something that made even seasoned detectives go quiet: a carefully built second slaughter bench. Not yet used, not yet bloodied. A sequel. This revelation reshaped how the court and the public saw Armin. Was he preparing for another volunteer? Had he been hoping for a recurring thing? A new lifestyle? Cannibalism as routine? In interviews, Armin denied this. He insisted that Bernd was a once-in-a-lifetime person, that no one else had ever matched his sincerity. But the evidence said otherwise. He had been looking again, and that turned the court's stomachs more than the meat ever did. Now, let's season this with a true psychological fact. Cannibalism as a fetish, technically called anthropophagy, has been documented in psychological literature as both a control fantasy and a deeply rooted attachment disorder. Some experts tie it to unresolved childhood trauma, particularly in people abandoned or emotionally neglected at a young age, which describes Armin perfectly. After his father left when he was 8, and his brothers soon after, he was left with only his strict, possessive mother, Waltrude. She had controlled everything: his schedule, his clothing, even his friends. He didn't learn to express affection normally. He internalized abandonment as something permanent, final. So when Armin read Hansel and Gretel and saw the witch preparing to eat the children, he didn't flinch. He felt understood. To him, eating someone wasn't a punishment. It was a solution, a way to never lose them again. Philosophers have dissected this, too. In particular, a school of thought loosely referred to as existential ingestion theory, which, yes, sounds made up, but is surprisingly robust, posits that consuming something or someone can be interpreted as an act of ultimate intimacy, literal incorporation, an obliteration of the boundaries between self and other. In other words, if I eat you, you can't leave me. That's not just romantic dysfunction. That's Greek tragedy with a grocery list. After his conviction, Armin was placed in Castle Prison. At first, he was a novelty. Inmates gave him nicknames: Chef, Mr. Steak, the friendly butcher. But he was quiet, cooperative, never caused trouble. He requested only two things: vegetarian meals and access to the prison library. He said he'd lost his appetite for meat. All meat. He didn't trust himself anymore. During his first year behind bars, he was visited by psychologists, filmmakers, and even one over-enthusiastic food anthropologist who brought him a loaf of homemade bread and started asking about pairing notes. Armin was gracious. He declined the bread, but he agreed to be interviewed. One interview became a small documentary. That documentary aired on late-night German TV. That episode made it to YouTube, and suddenly, Armin's quiet little nightmare became globally viral. Clips from the documentary were subtitled in English, Spanish, and Japanese. People debated the case in message boards, podcasts, ASMR channels, Reddit threads, college classes, and uncomfortable first dates. Some viewers thought Armin was evil incarnate. Others thought he was a tragic figure damaged. Yes, but not malicious. A man who tried to reach someone in the worst possible way, and succeeded far too well. And here's where things get even weirder. Armin began receiving fan mail, actual letters, sent to prison, from all over the world. Some offered marriage. Some offered recipes. One offered a voluntary tow. He never replied, but he kept them in a neat little stack in his cell, because some part of him still wanted to be known, still wanted company. He later told a psychologist, "I don't miss the act. I miss the connection. I just wanted someone to stay." That line sparked a flurry of academic essays. One, titled "Loneliness in the Age of Consumption," argued that Armin's story was a metaphor for the modern digital condition where people connect through screens, fantasies, and increasingly extreme forms of validation. In that sense, Armin wasn't a monster. He was a mirror, a deeply uncomfortable, blood-stained mirror. Meanwhile, in the prison library, Armin started writing. Not a memoir, not quite, but something. Pages filled with musings about loneliness, choice, moral paradoxes. He titled it, "My Brother, My Meal." Whether this was meant metaphorically, spiritually, or just very Germanly remains unclear. He submitted it to several publishers. One replied, "Beautifully written, deeply disturbing, absolutely unprintable." The manuscript was shelved, but bootleg excerpts made their way online. Lines like, "I thought love meant holding someone. Now I think it means not letting go. The mouth is not a weapon. It's a doorway. He wanted to be inside me. I didn't know I'd still hear him when I chewed." The prison eventually restricted his media access. Too many students were requesting interviews. Too many podcasters were sending gift baskets. One prison guard reportedly caught Armin trying to mail a hand-drawn comic about sentient sausages who talk about forgiveness. He had lost the spotlight, but he hadn't lost his audience. He never will. It's hard to be famous for eating someone. Sure, you might get a Wikipedia page, a Netflix mention, and a whole generation of people whispering your name at midnight sleepovers. But it's not the kind of celebrity that lands you a book deal and a line of cookware. Armin Meiwes knew this. By his second year in prison, he had settled into a rhythm. Wake up, eat breakfast porridge, fruit, occasionally toast, read, respond to letters, decline offers from filmmakers, and above all, avoid red meat. It wasn't a joke. He truly had become a vegetarian. Not for irony, not as a PR move, but because, as he put it in one interview, after Bernd, everything else felt impersonal. That statement alone was quoted so many times across the internet that it eventually became a meme. A Tumblr user paired it with a black and white photo of a sad ham sandwich and the caption, "Me, after a breakup." But behind the punchlines and clickbait titles, Armin's reality was still unfolding in ways the public didn't see. One lesser-known fact, Kassel Prison, like many German correctional facilities, runs on a rehabilitation model. Inmates have access to education, counseling, structured social time. The focus is not on punishment, but on reform, which meant Armin was invited to group therapy sessions. Let's take a moment to appreciate what those might have been like. Imagine sitting in a circle of men convicted of burglary, assault, maybe fraud, and across from you is a guy who once braised someone's thigh with thyme and served it next to green beans. The room probably smelled like anxiety and awkward coughs, yet, by most accounts, Armin was respectful, thoughtful. He listened more than he spoke. He never bragged. He never deflected blame. He would say things like, "I know I hurt someone," even if he wanted it. And once desire is a dangerous compass. During one group session, when asked why he hadn't stopped himself, he reportedly replied, "Because I didn't feel alone for the first time in years." That feeling is louder than guilt. Let that one marinate. Meanwhile, back in the outside world, the legend of the Rotenburg cannibal was evolving, not fading, mutating. Pop culture latched on hard. A wave of indie horror films emerged, loosely inspired by Armin's story. One had a plot about a dinner party where guests slowly realized the host was feeding them each other. Another, more stylized version, turned the cannibal into a misunderstood artist. And a third film, which barely concealed its German inspiration, was just titled Tender. None of them really captured the banality of it all. Because what made Armin's case so haunting wasn't the gore. It was the normalcy, the tea, the table manners, the fact that it wasn't driven by rage or chaos, but by loneliness, dressed in a well-ironed shirt. Even academic circles couldn't resist. Entire sociology panels were organized around the case. In 2007, a conference in Vienna titled Consent and Consumption Ethics in the Modern Age featured a keynote on Armin. The speaker was a bioethicist who opened with, "Tonight's dinner will not include pork," for psychological reasons. The story had also made it into law school hypotheticals, those strange scenarios designed to make students sweat. Suppose Party A consents to being killed and eaten by Party B. Party B films it. Party A dies. What crimes apply? Most students picked everything. A few picked none. One brave soul wrote in the margin, "Depends how it was seasoned." But if the outside world was intellectualizing the case, the inside world, Armin's world, was growing smaller. He rarely received visitors anymore. His family had long since distanced themselves. A few pen pals kept writing, but the novelty wore off. One former correspondent admitted in a podcast that they'd initially reached out for the thrill, but stopped after realizing he was just sad. Armin had become less Hannibal Lecter and more Boo Radley with a butcher's knife. Still, he wrote daily, journals, essays, unsent letters. And yes, he kept trying to revise his manuscript, My Brother, My Meal. The prison library refused to carry it, citing emotional disturbance potential. But Armin remained hopeful. He said, "Even if no one reads it, it means I existed." There's a psychological term for this mortality salience, the awareness of one's own death, and the attempt to create something lasting in response. People build pyramids, write books, start cults, have children. Armin, he ate someone, then tried to write about it in iambic prose. One letter, written in 2009 and later leaked online, contained the line, "Every time I chew now, I remember what it felt like to chew him. I am full of memory. No matter what I eat." That one went viral. It made its way into Reddit threads, ASMR voiceovers, even a line of novelty tote bags from a regrettable Etsy store. And yet, it's weirdly poetic. In a way, Armin was the human version of Pandora's lunchbox. Once the box was opened, once he'd tasted what he'd always dreamed of, he couldn't forget it. Couldn't go back. The hunger wasn't physical. It was emotional. Existential. He didn't want more victims. He wanted that one moment back, the moment someone saw him, really saw him, and said, "Yes, I'll be part of you." The rest digestion. In one of his final published interviews, Armin said, "I think about him every day, not with guilt, but with longing. He gave me what no one else ever did. He gave me permanence." Then he looked at the reporter and asked, "Do you think that's what love is?" The reporter didn't answer. She was still trying to finish her sandwich. By 2010, Armin Meiwes had become an oddly still point in the swirling storm of his own infamy. The press had mostly moved on. The documentaries had aired, been dissected on late-night Reddit threads, and filtered through YouTube explainers with bold thumbnails, like the guy who ate his date. Not clickbait. But while the public attention waned, Armin's story quietly began to mutate beyond true crime, beyond cannibal folklore, into something stranger. A sort of dark folk tale of the digital age. It was whispered about in psychology classes, half-quoted on Twitter, reimagined in fanfic forums that really should have had better moderators. He was no longer just a cannibal. He was the cannibal, capital C, the one who left a contract, the one who chilled his guilt in Tupperware, and inside Kassel prison. Armin read every word he could find. The guards gave him limited printouts, headlines, essays, occasionally full articles. He would annotate them in pencil, underlining philosophical points and occasionally correcting grammar. In the margins, he scribbled things like, "Not bloodthirsty. I hate the sight of blood." Bernd was not victim. He was participant. They keep missing the real question. Why was he the only one who stayed? He was obsessed with perception, with how the story was told. And speaking of storytelling, let's take a sharp left turn into one particularly odd incident. In 2011, a theater group in Berlin staged a surrealist play loosely based on the Meiwes case. It was called Eat Me Gently. The entire production took place on a minimalist set shaped like a dinner table. The actors wore aprons. One monologued while peeling potatoes for 20 minutes. One reviewer called it Kafka meets Gordon Ramsay in Purgatory. Armin wasn't allowed to see it, of course, but he heard about it. A fellow inmate had a cousin who'd attended and sent a postcard describing the performance. Armin was flattered, confused, then flattered again. He later wrote, "Strange to be interpreted as art. I want it to be a recipe, not a metaphor." Now here's a fact you probably didn't expect. Germany's penal system permits inmates to engage in correspondence with journalists, artists, and academics, under strict supervision. So Armin started replying, politely, in neat handwriting, sometimes pages long. His letters began circulating in academic circles, not because they were sensational, but because they were unnervingly human. He talked about gardening in the prison courtyard. He grew cucumbers and once named one Bernd Jr. He wrote about dreams, recurring themes, kitchens, trains, softly humming freezers. He wrote about the philosophical limits of consent, quoting Kant, Rousseau, and just once SpongeBob, just once. There's a SpongeBob episode where he tries to serve himself to hungry jellyfish, and no one stops him, because he's smiling. That's not consent. That's sadness with good posture. Somewhere, a philosophy undergrad put that in their thesis. Meanwhile, Armin's story had inspired another wave true crime tourism. The town of Rothenburg, where the events took place, began attracting an unfortunate breed of curious visitors. They took photos outside his old mansion, tried to peek through the hedges. One particularly enthusiastic fan was caught trying to dig up the garden, claiming she was looking for a piece of culinary history. Police were not amused. The house itself had been sold off quietly in 2006 and was now owned by a retiree couple who had zero interest in discussing its past. They installed a very sturdy fence, several cameras, and a sign that read, "No interviews, no tours, no dinner parties." That didn't stop some pranksters from leaving bratwurst packages at the gate. Elsewhere in Germany, public discourse around the case still simmered. In 2012, a legal symposium in Frankfurt revisited the Meiwes case as a cornerstone for ethical discourse. One of the panels was titled, "When Consent Collides with Crime." Another, more provocatively, "Cannibalism and the Crisis of Liberal Autonomy." A heated debate broke out over whether Armin's initial sentence, manslaughter, had been more appropriate than his eventual life imprisonment. One philosopher argued that the law should protect the sanctity of life, even against its owner. Another countered, "Then, whose life is it?" That question still echoes in lecture halls today. And speaking of echoes, let's talk about the internet. While the Cannibal Cafe had long since vanished from the web, its spirit lived on. Shadowy corners of the internet continued to harbor fetish forums, body modification fantasies, and unsettling message boards filled with digital howls into the void. But what changed after Armin's arrest was tone. Before, these forums were niche, dark, barely moderated. After Meiwes, they became haunted houses still active, but self-aware. Posts were filled with references to the Rotenberg case. People quoted Bernd's contract. Some treated it with eerie reverence. Others turned it into meme bait. There's a strange phenomenon in internet culture when a real horror enters the meme cycle. It mutates. It becomes a punchline, then a myth, then somehow cozy. And that's what happened here. TikToks began appearing, with soft lo-fi music and captions like, "This man wanted to be eaten." And the other guy said, "Sure." Cut to dancing vegetables, zoom on a pepper grinder. The words "meat is love" appear in Comic Sans. Humanity is weird, but let's not forget the reality. Bernd was a real person. He had hopes, pain, a job, co-workers, a past. He struggled deeply with his identity and desires. And in the final weeks of his life, he poured all of that into one irreversible request. Make me disappear. Make me part of something. Make me matter. Armin answered with a fork, and now, more than a decade later, neither of them can be mentioned without the other. They're fused not just in act, but in history, in the ultimate, most bizarre way. They got what they wanted. One man was never alone again, and the other, never forgotten. You'd think that after a man eats another man with consent, with seasoning, and with leftovers labeled like fine cuts of lamb, the story might taper off. You'd imagine the world would eventually move on, file it under deeply disturbing but rare, and return to watching cat videos. But that's not what happened. Instead, Armin Meiwes' story became a kind of dark gravity. Well, the closer you looked, the more you realized it wasn't just a one-off horror show. It was a cracked mirror held up to the digital age, the nature of desire, and the limits of what any society can tolerate before its moral compass starts short-circuiting. And part of that mirror was shaped like a freezer. Let's go back to the freezer, affectionately named Monica. Monica wasn't special, technologically speaking. A sturdy commercial-grade deep freeze, German-made, efficient, and reliable. But to forensic psychologists, Monica became a symbol. She was the cold heart of the crime, both literally and metaphorically. It wasn't the killing that disturbed them most, or even the consumption. It was the ritual of it, the preservation, the routine. Armin didn't eat Bernd in one feverish night like a man possessed. He carved. He labeled. He vacuum-sealed. He paced himself. For 10 months, he came home, opened Monica, picked a cut, defrosted it, and cooked. Sometimes he paired it with wine, sometimes with vegetables, sometimes just toast. And here's your real-world fact of the day. Long-term frozen meat, even human meat, retains nutrients but begins to lose flavor complexity after about 6 months due to freezer burn and moisture crystallization. So Armin had unknowingly been living with the added indignity of fading taste. That didn't stop him from savoring every meal. He described it in his writings like communion. Each bite, a memory, each swallow, a promise kept. That line, by the way, is now tattooed on the forearm of at least one very confused barista in Portland. Back to the present early 2010s. Germany's media had grown increasingly squeamish about revisiting the case. A law had been passed restricting glorification of violent crimes, particularly when the criminal profits. This is why Armin couldn't sell his manuscript, couldn't give paid interviews, and why documentaries had to tread lightly or risk lawsuits. But the story kept resurfacing in new forms. A Dutch artist created a series of disturbing but meticulously crafted ceramic dinner plates, each painted with quotes from Armin's interviews and stylized cuts of meat shaped like hearts. A Polish metal band released an EP titled Second Course. And in one of the strangest moments, a German cooking show received complaints because their announcer accidentally said slow-cooked human thigh instead of pork thigh during a voiceover segment. Armin, locked away in his quiet cell, heard about none of this, or rather, only fragments. Prison staff were under strict orders to limit his access to anything that could sensationalize the crime. But occasionally, stories leaked in. Visitors, legal aids, even a nun. Yes, a nun, Sister Marianne. Age 62 began corresponding with Armin in 2013. She believed in redemption for everyone, no matter how far gone. She'd worked in prisons for decades and once de-escalated a fight between two murderers using only a crossword puzzle and a prayer. She wrote to Armin in simple language, asked him questions, not about the crime, about his soul. He replied. Their letters weren't religious at first. He talked about gardening, the books he read, his dreams. She asked about hope. He said, I don't know what that is anymore, but I do know quiet. Eventually, they met in person, and here's the kicker: they got along. She described him as soft-spoken, respectful, and deeply aware of the silence he lives in. She brought him oranges. He gave her a poem he'd written titled The Man in the Freezer. No one's quite sure what her order thought of that. Meanwhile, criminologists continued to use Armin's case as a foundational teaching tool. He wasn't a spree killer, not a psychopath in the classic sense. He didn't enjoy pain, didn't relish death. What he wanted was love, possession, and the impossible permanence of making someone part of himself. That concept has since been classified in certain psychological texts under a niche term, consumptive attachment disorder, not to be confused with Victorian tuberculosis, which would be far less alarming in a dinner context. In one conference, a professor of ethics pointed out that Armin's actions, while horrifying, expose the absurd vulnerabilities in how society handles online deviance. This man literally posted a murder ad, she said, and people replied, eagerly, that should frighten us more than the eating. Because the Cannibal Cafe wasn't the only one. Since its demise, other forums have popped up, darker, encrypted, hidden behind layers of anonymity. Some get shut down, others evolve into even stranger niches. And yes, people still post eat me requests. Some are clearly fantasy, some are not. One undercover journalist found a post in 2015 that read, looking to be consumed slowly, not in one night. Make me last. And underneath it, someone had commented, are you into vintage methods or more into sous vide? You laugh, and then you stare at your stove with new suspicion. Back inside prison, Armin had begun withdrawing more. His letters slowed. He stopped writing in his journal as often. The once careful annotations gave way to short, repetitive phrases. A counselor reported that he was slipping into his own mythology. That's what happens when a person becomes a legend too early. They start living in the past tense. And Armin, he had become a bedtime story, a cautionary tale, a trivia answer, a lecture slide. He was cooked, but he still remembered Bernd. Every meal, every moment, every soft sentence before the end. There's a quote from one of his unpublished letters. People ask why I did it. But that's not the right question. The right question is, why did he stay? And the answer is, because I asked him to. At the bottom of the page, he'd drawn a dinner plate, empty. At some point, even the strangest stories begin to gather dust. Armin Meiwes, once the center of an international media storm, now lived like an old book in the corner of a library, still full of horror, still deeply unread. In Castle Prison, he had become part of the background noise, a man who read too much, talked too little, and made other inmates nervous without ever saying a word. He wasn't a threat. He wasn't volatile. He was just there. And there's something eerie about that kind of quiet. Because every so often, someone new would arrive at the prison, some young inmate with a loud mouth and a love of true crime, and they'd whisper down the corridor, "Hey, that's the guy who ate someone." Right. And the guards would sigh. And Armin would glance up from his book, and then he'd return to the page, because it wasn't his story anymore. It belonged to everyone else, which is ironic, considering the whole point of what he did was to make someone his forever. Let's rewind the tape literally. The infamous recording of the night Armin killed and ate Bernd had long since been locked away. But it haunted every legal, medical, and academic institution that had ever touched the case. It became the world's most forbidden snuff film, referenced constantly, seen only by a select few, and feared for what it represented: calm, calculated destruction. Psychiatrists who viewed it reported strange reactions. Some couldn't finish it. Some developed insomnia. One reportedly left the field entirely and became a florist. Whether this is true or apocryphal, no one's quite sure. But it feels correct. What made the footage so disturbing, they said, wasn't gore. It was tenderness. Bernd's voice was quiet, calm, even warm. He didn't scream. He didn't resist. He joked. He gave instructions. He said, at one point, "Don't forget the salt, and later I want to feel it." If this were fiction, no editor would let it pass. Too absurd, too polite. But it wasn't fiction. It was dinner, and it shattered the boundary between what we think we'd do and what people sometimes do when the rules are taken away. Here's a hauntingly real fact. The World Health Organization classifies extreme paraphilias like vor fantasies being consumed or consuming others as rare but not non-existent psychological conditions. Most never act on it. But the internet, bless its chaotic neutrality, has made it easier than ever for fantasy and opportunity to meet halfway. Armin's case proved that even the most fringe desires can become logistics with enough broadband. Let's talk about logistics. After Armin was imprisoned, his house, the infamous 44-room mansion in Rothenburg, sat vacant for several years. Rumors swirled that it was haunted, that police had missed more videos buried in the walls, that Armin had built a second freezer beneath the floorboards and filled it with handwritten recipes. All untrue, mostly. Eventually, the property was bought by a couple from out of town who didn't want attention. They gutted most of the interior, knocked out the slaughter room, and turned it into what they called a peaceful guest space. But the energy of the house lingered. Locals avoided the street. Children dared each other to run past the front gate. Delivery drivers sometimes left packages at the curb, unwilling to get closer. It became an architectural ghost story. At one point, a travel blogger passed through and took a photo of the house from behind a bush. The caption read, "Nothing creepy here, just a normal German home with excellent insulation and deeply haunted tiles." The photo was taken down after the owners filed a complaint. Meanwhile, Bernd Brandis remained something of a ghost himself. His name had been immortalized in court documents, news articles, and hundreds of speculative blogs, but few people knew who he'd really been. Not until much later. When a journalist named Elena Schaefer published a quietly brilliant profile, She'd tracked down some of Bernd's co-workers, a former neighbor, an old friend from his university days. They painted a portrait of a man who was deeply private, brilliant at his job, generous to a fault, but solitary, withdrawn. Someone who never quite felt like he belonged. Elena wrote, he was the kind of person who, when he laughed, looked around first to make sure it was okay. He smiled like he was asking permission, and when he disappeared, most people assumed he'd finally decided to be alone for good. In one interview, a former girlfriend recalled him saying, "I think the only way I'll ever be truly seen is if I vanish." It broke her heart then. It broke the internet later. Because that was the part of the story that had never gotten proper airtime. Bernd Brandis didn't just want to die. He wanted to be consumed. He wanted to mean something. He wanted to leave in a way that was unforgettable. And the worst part, he succeeded. But at what cost? This is where the academic world, once again, had a philosophical meltdown. Debates erupted on whether Bernd's decision was valid, or a symptom of mental illness, whether Armin should have been charged with murder, or considered an accomplice to suicide, whether the tape should have been destroyed, or preserved as legal precedent. Some argued that consent is meaningless if it results in non-existence. Others countered that autonomy must include the right to self-destruct. No one agreed. Everyone published papers. And the internet, as always, turned it into merch. There were t-shirts, coffee mugs, podcasts with pun titles like Cold Cuts, The Cannibal Files. A restaurant in Brooklyn was briefly shut down after someone posted a fake review claiming they served Meiwes-style brisket. They did not. But they now serve a tofu dish called Bernd's Redemption. Everywhere you looked, the case lingered. In jokes, in think pieces, in quiet midnight retellings on podcasts that began with, "So there was this guy who just really wanted to be eaten." And in the middle of all this noise, Armin sat quietly, in his cell, reading, writing, sometimes watering a single potted plant by the window. He named it Frank, a callback to his childhood imaginary friend. He no longer responded to letters, no more interviews, no more quotes. He was done being a metaphor. He'd had his meal, and now he wanted silence. By the mid-2010s, the world had moved on to newer horrors, economic crises, viral pandemics, whatever the hell TikTok was turning into. But Armin Meiwes remained a quiet legend, tucked away behind prison walls and clickbait memories. His story had done something strange. It had stopped feeling real. People recounted it like folklore. The man who signed a contract to be eaten. The polite German cannibal who labeled his leftovers and served human flesh with green beans. It felt like a bedtime tale told to keep kids off dark web forums. Brush your teeth, Timmy, or you'll end up sautéed in Kassel. But make no mistake, this wasn't an urban legend. It was a true story, with legal paperwork, with consequences, with bones. And in a world increasingly desensitized to online horror, Armin's case held a dark distinction. It was one of the few that had no villain. Let's revisit the contract. When the original police discovery went public, excerpts from Bernd Brandis' signed agreement were published in court documents. The language was surreal, matter-of-fact. A man outlining how and when he would be killed, by whom, and how his body should be used after. It was clinical, emotional, unshakably calm. He had included multiple escape clauses, opportunities to back out. He never used them. He'd even added a request that his skull be preserved as a keepsake, if it's not too much trouble. The skull was eventually buried, without ceremony, without a plaque. And Armin kept his memories. In an interview, no one expected him to grant years after his last media contact. He told a court-appointed therapist, "I think I wanted to make something beautiful, something no one else had. Everyone talks about love and says it's forever. But what's more forever than digestion?" The therapist described him as calm, reflective, and ethically consistent in a way that makes your stomach turn. She also noted that his remorse, if it existed, didn't look like guilt. It looked like grief. Here's where things take an even stranger turn. In 2016, a group of bioethics students in Oslo created an experimental debate club focused entirely on fringe consent. Armin's case was the cornerstone. They published a white paper proposing new legal terminology for suicidal mutualism, a term describing situations where one person desires death and another is willing to fulfill it in exchange for emotional or psychological fulfillment. This idea spread like wildfire. Academia, law school moots, even a few fringe philosophers latched onto it, quoting Armin in papers with titles like "To Swallow is Divine, a Critique of Postmodern Consent." That one got banned from at least 3 academic journals. Rightfully so. But beneath the pretentious jargon, there was something profoundly uncomfortable being unearthed. What do we do with 2 people who say yes to the unthinkable? We're used to stories where someone is hurt against their will. We're not built for ones where everyone's smiling through it. Let's make this concrete with a clinical reality check. According to forensic psychologists, both men met diagnostic criteria for rare paraphilic disorders, Armin for sexual cannibalism, Bernd for extreme masochistic self-annihilation. But neither was legally insane. Both knew what they were doing, understood the consequences, could navigate day-to-day life. Bernd held a steady job until the end. Armin paid taxes. They weren't delusional. They weren't psychotic. They were just not like us. And yet, in their writing, in their emails, in their letters to each other, there were moments of unsettling recognition, jokes, references, nostalgia. They discussed Star Trek episodes in between death fantasies. Bernd brought his favorite cologne on the day of his killing, because he wanted to smell nice when it happened. And Armin set the table. There's a debate in the legal world about whether Armin's case set any precedent. Technically, it didn't. It was ruled murder. No exception. No consent loophole. But in the cultural world, it changed everything. It changed how we think about bodily autonomy, about the internet's ability to make the impossible logistically manageable, about how, with enough connection, even cannibalism can feel like romance. One academic essay noted that the entire episode read like a twisted fairy tale. Lonely man. Magic house. A visitor who arrives willingly. A meal that ends the spell. Only this one wasn't written by the Brothers Grimm. It was written in chat logs and blood. That metaphor stuck. In fact, someone wrote a graphic novel inspired by it. Stylized. Strange. Dreamlike, called Bone China. The story follows a lonely man who eats someone to preserve their soul, only to find the voice won't stop whispering inside him. It became a cult classic. Critics called it haunting, nauseating, and weirdly tender. The author never confirmed the inspiration. She didn't have to. And what of Armin now? He's still in Kassel. Still quiet. Older now. He walks with a limp from a knee injury, works in the prison's library, and is reportedly one of the most orderly inmates they've ever had. One guard, in a leaked memoir draft, wrote, "He's not what you expect. He's the guy who says thank you when you pass the salt." Because, in some bizarre way, Armin never stopped being a host. He just ran out of guests. He no longer grants interviews. He no longer writes about Bernd. But sometimes, just sometimes, he's heard humming in his cell. A little tune. Soft and simple. The kind of song you'd hear playing in the background of a kitchen when dinner's on and the wine is breathing. No one knows what it is, but someone swears it's the melody from a Star Trek episode, one where the crew gets trapped in a holodeck and no one knows what's real anymore. Fitting. Because Armin's story never really returned to reality. It lives somewhere else now, in the uneasy part of our brains where curiosity and dread shake hands and say, "Okay, just one more click." By the time Armin Meiwes turned 60, he was more myth than man. To most people outside of Germany, especially younger generations raised on crime podcasts and unsettling TikToks, he was that guy. The one who ate someone, The polite one. The one who made dinner and history in the same night. In internet lore, he'd been flattened into a trivia question: who was the German cannibal who ate a consenting victim? But for those who dug deeper, for the lawyers, the psychiatrists, the academic obsessives, Armin wasn't just a cautionary tale. He was a test case for the kind of questions nobody wants to ask in polite society. Questions like, how far does consent go? Is loneliness a form of insanity? And what happens when two people agree to something unforgivable? Even the German courts hadn't wanted to touch it again. After his retrial and conviction for murder, Armin's appeals were consistently rejected. But quietly, there were no more grandstanding judges, no op-eds demanding his release, just a collective shrug from the system, as if to say, we dealt with it once. That's enough. Meanwhile, he faded from the headlines, but not from the culture. Let's talk about cannibal aesthetics. Yes, that's a real term now. Thanks, Internet. It's the name given to a strange, niche trend in visual media, elegant horror with food motifs. Think Hannibal the TV show, with its charcuterie board murders and symphonic dinner parties, or the film Raw, where a young woman discovers an appetite for flesh alongside her sexual awakening, or Fresh, where cannibalism is a metaphor for modern dating. These stories don't just scare, they seduce, and they all, in some way, echo Armin, not because he was the first cannibal, but because he was the realist, not a serial killer, not driven by chaos, just a man who asked, and another who said yes. And when you strip away the horror tropes, that's what makes the story so deeply weird. It wasn't madness, it was manners. Even now, the Armin case is invoked in debates over online content moderation. Back in the early 2000s, the Cannibal Cafe existed in a legal gray zone protected by free speech, ignored by regulators. But today, that site would be nuked off the map in a heartbeat. Yet the content remains, repackaged, reframed, and sometimes unknowingly echoed. In one chilling example, a user on a fringe site posted, "I want someone to make me into something permanent. Not art, not memory, just matter." It's Bernd's ghost, talking through a new username. Internet archivists have tried to trace these kinds of echoes. In fact, a team of digital forensics researchers at a Berlin university published a 2020 report called Meiwes and the Algorithm Cannibalism in Online Recommendation Systems. They found that YouTube's algorithm had, for a brief time, been suggesting cooking tutorials alongside true crime documentaries because the keyword meat preparation appeared in both. One viewer reported going from how to braise pork shoulder to the Rotenberg cannibal full story in 6 clicks. That's the modern Ouroboros. We consume stories of consumption until we can't tell if we're watching a documentary or a recipe. Meanwhile, Armin stayed quiet. He took up painting in 2017. Nothing graphic, mostly landscapes, trees, clouds, a lot of still lifes. One depicted a single plate with a spoon beside it, and no food. Titled Silence. He never showed the paintings publicly, but a prison staffer mentioned them in an interview, said they were peaceful in a way that makes you uneasy. That was Armin's whole vibe, now unsettling peace. His old manuscript, My Brother, My Meal, was never officially published, but it circulated online in pieces translated, reblogged, analyzed like it was some haunted gospel. One passage stood out. "I didn't eat him out of hatred, or need, or hunger. I ate him because he gave me a gift. The gift was himself. The price was everything, and the taste was memory." Critics couldn't decide if it was horrifying or beautiful. Fans said it reminded them of romantic poetry. Detractors called it gastropoetic narcissism. One YouTube ASMR narrator read it over soft piano music and somehow made it worse. But whether whispered or shouted, the fascination remained. And here's something else most people don't know. There was nearly a second Armin. In 2019, a man in Slovakia was arrested after advertising for a willing meal partner. The structure of his ad nearly identical to Armin's. The wording phrases lifted directly from archived forum posts. When police raided his apartment, they found knives, restraints, and a folder labeled Rotenberg Redux. He hadn't found a volunteer yet. The copycat confessed that he was inspired by the story. Thought it was the purest form of love. Claimed he didn't want to kill anyone, just share something final. Sound familiar? The incident reignited. The debate was telling Armin's story, fueling more Armin's. A German ethics panel met again. Experts testified. Parents' groups protested. A social media trend briefly emerged. Jack's "Don't be a feast." And Armin, he just kept painting. According to prison staff, he said only one thing when he heard about the Slovakian copycat. He didn't understand. It wasn't about the act. It was about the person. It's always been about the person. Bernd, whose name had been blurred and twisted by time, is often forgotten in the retelling. Reduced to the guy who said yes. But that yes changed everything. In one quiet court transcript, you can still find his final written words before the event. "I offer myself freely, with the hope that I become more than I am." It's the kind of sentence that sounds spiritual, tragic, maybe even beautiful, until you realize it led to a recipe. So here we are, years later, Armin in prison, aging, the world outside, still talking about what happened, trying to understand it, to name it, to fold it into categories where it doesn't really fit. And always, in the back of the collective brain, one question echoing like a dinner bell. Is this what love looks like when no one ever taught you how to be held? By now, the edges of the story are fraying. The facts are still there, cataloged, archived, fact-checked into oblivion. But the feeling of the story has changed. It's no longer just about a man who ate another man. It's about what happens when the internet, loneliness, and unchecked desire crash into each other like a three-car pileup on the Autobahn. Because Armin Meiwes didn't just commit a crime. He created a blueprint, and that blueprint consensual death, documented, ritualized, and uploaded would go on to haunt digital spaces for years. By 2021, online moderators were dealing with an odd trend. Forums, chat servers, and even Reddit subcommunities dedicated to consumptive fantasies were popping up again. Some were roleplay, many were not. And every time one got flagged and taken down, 3 more popped up with new usernames and creepier acronyms. The story of Armin and Bernd had gone full Ouroboros. It was eating itself. Let's pause for a real-world update. In 2022, Germany's Federal Constitutional Court quietly issued a legal commentary clarifying that no form of consent can justify an act resulting in the death of another person for non-medical non-assisted suicide purposes. The footnote direct reference to Meiwes v. State of Hesse. It was buried under layers of legalese, but the meaning was clear. We are still cleaning up after this. In another strange twist, Armin himself submitted a formal request that year to be transferred to a lower security facility. Not because he wanted to escape. He wasn't that kind of prisoner. He just wanted a window that opened. He said in his request, "I would like to smell the seasons again." It was denied. He still paints. He still reads. He rarely writes. His plant, Frank, is reportedly doing okay. Guards say he talks to it sometimes. Nothing dramatic. Just soft muttering. "Too much sun today." Or occasionally. You remember the garden, don't you? He doesn't receive mail anymore. Or at least, he doesn't open it. He stacks it neatly in a drawer, as if letting the words marinate, which is disturbingly on brand. But in the wider world, the echoes of his story never really stop. A short film wins a student award in Prague, The Quiet Meal, featuring 2 strangers sharing a final dinner in eerie silence. The script inspired by Armin's transcripts. A startup AI text generator is found to have absorbed parts of Armin's letters into its training data. This discovery leads to a minor scandal when someone types "write a love letter" and gets "I want you inside me forever. I want to taste your goodbye." Oops. Even true crime content creators start avoiding the topic. Not out of fear, out of fatigue. Because here's the thing. The story is too much. Too weird to sensationalize. Too quiet to scream about. Too intimate to laugh at for long. It sticks with you. Like a low hum behind the eyes. Like a smell you can't quite place. That's the part people don't talk about. The sensory details. The padded room Armin built with his own hands. The sound of the freezer door sealing. The quiet "thank you, Bernd" whispered as he lay bleeding in the bath. The sizzling hiss when Armin dropped the first piece of human flesh into the frying pan. The sound of chewing. And how still the house must have been afterward. Here's a detail we haven't talked about yet after the meal. Armin reportedly lit a candle and said a short, improvised prayer. Not to God, not to Satan, just to Bernd. It went something like, "You are with me now. I will carry you. I will not waste you." There's something unbearably sincere about that. And that sincerity is what makes the story so heavy. This wasn't Jeffrey Dahmer. This wasn't rage or sexual frenzy. This wasn't chaos. It was care. And that makes it worse. Because care, twisted the wrong way, becomes devotion without mercy. It becomes Armin, brushing Bernd's hair aside before the knife. It becomes Bernd, smiling through the pain, saying, "Yes, this is what I wanted." It becomes ritual. Let's call it what it is. A consensual sacrifice. Staged in a kitchen. For no audience but the self. Modern philosophers have started calling this the Rotenberg dilemma. If both parties consent to something unthinkable, if neither is coerced, do we punish it because it's wrong? Or because it reminds us we're capable of agreeing to anything? A recent ethics paper framed it this way. The Armin Meiwes case is not a question of morality. It is a question of mirrors, and what we do when they show us something we can't laugh away. And maybe that's why the story still lingers in dorm rooms, in podcast episodes, in long-forgotten forum threads, not because people want to reenact it, but because they almost understand it. We've all felt lonely. We've all wanted someone to stay. We've all whispered, "Don't leave." Armin just made it literal. Bernd just made it final. And now, their story hangs over us, not like a ghost, but like a dinner bell, ringing, softly. Every time someone says, "Hey, have you heard about the guy who ate someone?" Yes, we've heard. We just don't know how to swallow it. There's no neat way to end this story. No satisfying conclusion. No clever moral. No convenient villain to lock away and forget. Just two men, one freezer, and a shared delusion that love could be cooked, consumed, and stored in labeled plastic bags. Armin Meiwes is still alive, still in prison, still polite. He waters his plant, eats vegetarian meals, writes occasionally. Sometimes he's seen staring out his small, shatterproof window, watching seasons drift by in grayscale. He no longer speaks about Bernd, not even when prompted. Not even in interviews he doesn't give anymore. The last words anyone remembers him saying on the subject were quietly delivered to a prison psychologist who had asked gently if he regretted it. Armin looked up, thought for a while, then said, "If you take away the blood, the camera, the cooking, it was just a man who wanted to be known." And I said, yes, that's the line that stuck. Because at the core of this horror story isn't hunger, or madness, or violence. It's recognition. Bernd Brandis wanted to disappear in a way that felt meaningful. He didn't just want to die. He wanted to be transformed. And Armin, for all his warped thinking, offered that transformation. It wasn't painless. It wasn't clean. But it was willing. And in a way no one wants to admit it was shared. The most chilling part of the tale is that for a few short hours, in a cold German house with soft music and a flickering candle, no one was alone. So now, the world does what it always does, processes tragedy through time and irony. There are memes, recipes, legal case studies, films, dissertations, One particularly misguided chef on YouTube once made a Meiwes-inspired lentil loaf. The video was taken down. The internet is still debating whether it was a performance art piece or just terrible branding. But under the noise, the story remains the same. Two strangers met on the internet. One wanted to die and be eaten. The other wanted to kill and consume someone, but only if it was mutually agreed upon, ethically choreographed, and ideally prepared with wine reduction and herbs. They made a contract. They followed it. And the world has never really known what to do with that. Because we're not built for stories where everyone says yes to something unforgivable. It doesn't fit our neat little boxes. It doesn't resolve with punishment alone. It doesn't let us breathe a sigh of relief and say, well, at least I'd never do that. Because at some point in this story, if you're honest, you felt something creep under your skin. Not horror, recognition. Maybe you've been that lonely. Maybe you've wanted to be seen, consumed, understood, no matter the cost. Maybe you've felt the ache of being untouched for too long. And maybe you've wondered, in the quiet places of your mind, what would I give for someone to never leave? Armin asked that question. Bernd answered it, and we're still trying to understand how their answer became a legacy. So as you settle in, wherever you are, lights low, earbuds buzzing with true crime. Static, remember this. Not all monsters grow fangs. Not all victims run. And not every horror lives in the scream. Some are soft, some say please, and some get served with a side of potatoes.